Okay, so picture this. A massive document, well over 1,000 pages, lands on Capitol Hill. It's just past the U.S. House, heading to the Senate. And President Trump's already given it a name, his one big, beautiful bill. And it's definitely making waves, stirring up a lot of talk.
Oh, absolutely. Not just in D.C., but, in financial markets, political circles everywhere. It's big news.
So our mission here in this deep dive is to really roll up our sleeves, get into this thing. We want to unpack its main parts, understand why proponents are calling it beautiful, and maybe more importantly, look at the really big implications our source material says this bill could have, both, fiscally and socially.
It really is a huge piece of legislation. It tries to bundle a whole range of policy goals together, reflecting a pretty specific agenda. And, well, like anything this ambitious, it's already getting a lot of pushback, a lot of debate, even from within the party supporting it.
Definitely. And the insights we're working with today, they come specifically from an article in the Indian Express. They've done a really good job laying out both sides. The promises, what supporters like, but also the major concerns critics are raising. And for anyone tracking crucial current affairs, maybe you're deep in UPSC prep, or honestly just want to be properly informed about major global shifts, this is really relevant stuff. Gives you that framework. Okay, so let's unpack this. All right, first things first, that name. Big and beautiful bill. What's really behind that label seems like it's directly about delivering on campaign promises, right? Things that need laws passed.
Exactly right. It's meant to be this single big package covering many of those core policy ideas. The Indian Express article points to 5 key things proponents highlight. First up, a big one, making those 2017 income and estate tax cuts permanent and even extending them. They were set to expire, you see.
Okay. So those tax cuts from a few years back, this bill wants to lock them in for good.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
And not just keep them, but the source says introduce new tax cuts too, specifically for things like overtime pay, tips, even some Social Security income. And there's a specific climb from the White House mentioned. They're saying Americans earning between roughly $30,000 and $80,000 a year could see a 15% tax cut next year.
15%. For that group, that sounds like a pretty significant promise. Okay, what else is in this big and beautiful package?
Well, there's also quite a bit of new government spending planned. The article highlights 2 main areas: boosting border security, aimed at, curbing illegal immigration, and also increasing funding and capabilities for the U.S. military and defense overall.
So tax cuts and more spending? Seems like a common theme. Anything else?
Yes, there's also a part focused on, let's say, government efficiency, trying to cut down on what they call waste, fraud, and abuse in how federal money is spent.
Okay, trying to find some savings there. Tax cuts, spending increases, efficiency drives. And the 5th point, I gather this one's a bit technical, but essential for the government to function.
That's the one. Raising the debt ceiling. It sounds complicated, but basically it's the legal limit on how much the U.S. government can borrow. Think of it like a credit card limit for the country. Since the government usually spends more than it takes in taxes each year, runs a deficit, it has to borrow. If it hits the ceiling,
It can't pay its bills.
exactly, it can't pay for things it's already committed to: salaries, Social Security, even interest on the debt it already has.
Yeah.
So raising the ceiling is, necessary just to keep the government operating and meeting its obligations.
Right, necessary because of those deficits you mentioned. Okay, so those are the 5 points supporters are pushing. But, and this is a big but the article dives into, there's another side to this. Serious concerns are coming up from economists, politicians, even some Republicans, like Senator Josh Hawley. This is where it gets, really interesting.
It does. The source really focuses on 2 main areas of concern that paint a much less beautiful picture, let's say. The first big one is the potential negative impact on the country's finances. The fiscal and macroeconomic side of things.
Okay, how so?
Well, it's kind of basic math, right? You've got
Yeah.
measures cutting government income, the tax cuts, and at the same time, measures increasing government spending. Put those together, and it almost inevitably worsens the government's budget situation. The deficit gets bigger.
And the starting point isn't exactly great, is it?
No, not at all. The source points out the U.S. federal deficit, that yearly gap between spending and revenue, was already quite high in 2024, about 6.4% of U.S. GDP. Many economists think, anything over 3% is getting into worrying territory.
6.4%.
Yeah. And just for context, the article gives this really striking comparison. That 2024 deficit was about $1.9 trillion. That's roughly half of India's entire GDP in 2024.
Wow. Comparing the U.S. deficit to half of India's economy, that really does hit home. That's just 1 year's gap.
Exactly. And every year's deficit adds to the total national debt. The source shows the overall debt compared to the size of the economy. The debt to GDP ratio is already climbing fast. It's around 120% now, and the projections mentioned suggest it could hit maybe 200% in the next decade if things continue like this.
200%. That sounds unsustainable.
That's the word being used. The article mentions that even policymakers, like the U.S. Federal Reserve Chair, Jay Powell, have openly said this kind of rising debt path isn't sustainable long-term.
So what happens then when people start thinking it's unsustainable? Does it worry the folks lending money to the U.S.?
It absolutely does. That's a key consequence the source gets into. Global investors, the people and institutions buying U.S. government bonds, they start getting a bit nervous, more cautious about lending more money.
And you can see that nervousness in the market.
Yes. The article points to things like falling U.S. government credit ratings and rising bond yields. Remember that Moody's downgrade back on May 17th, that was even before this bill passed the House. That was huge. It meant for the first time ever, none of the big three rating agencies, Fitch, S&P, Moody's, gave U.S. debt their top AAA rating.
Really? That's historic.
It is, and Moody's specifically mentioned worries about future deficits, projecting they could reach 9% of GDP by 2035. That was part of their reasoning.
Okay, so the credit rating drops. What about the bond yields you mentioned? What does that mean practically?
It means borrowing gets more expensive for the U.S. government. When investors are less eager to buy bonds, the price of those bonds tends to fall. And there's an inverse relationship. When bond prices fall, their yields, which represent the effective interest rate, go up.
So the government has to pay more interest to convince people to lend it money.
Exactly.
And you mentioned a ripple effect earlier. This doesn't just stop with the government's borrowing costs, does it?
No, and this is really crucial for everyone listening. U.S. government debt is seen as the safest investment in the world, sort of a benchmark. So its interest rate influences all other interest rates. When the market demands a higher yield on U.S. government bonds, the interest rates for mortgages, car loans, credit cards, business investments, basically borrowing costs for citizens and companies across the U.S., they tend to go up too.
Wow, okay. So the government's budget issues can actually make it more expensive for everyday people to borrow money. That's a very direct link.
It is. It creates upward pressure on interest rates throughout the economy.
All right, that's the big macroeconomic fiscal concern, very clearly explained. What was the second major area of worry the article highlighted?
The second one is about the redistributive effects. Basically, who wins and who loses from this bill across different income levels.
Redistributive, like how it shifts wealth around.
Sort of, yeah. The article quotes economist Justin Wolfers calling the bill anti-Robin Hood.
Anti-Robin Hood, why that term?
Well, the argument, as explained in the source, is that the bill effectively transfers resources from lower-income people to higher-income people, mostly through those big tax cuts that tend to benefit wealthier folks more, while at the same time potentially cutting back on government support programs that help the poor.
Okay, that's a strong claim. Does the source provide evidence for that?
It does. It heavily references an analysis by the Congressional Budget Office, the CBO. And the article makes a point of saying the CBO provides objective, nonpartisan information. So it's seen as a neutral scorekeeper.
Right, the CBO is respected for being impartial.
Yeah.
So what did their analysis find overall?
Well, the CBO projected that while household resources might increase overall in the U.S. over the next decade because of the bill, the really critical finding is that these gains are not spread evenly. Not at all.
Not spread evenly. Okay, so how does it break down? What specifics did the CBO find for different income groups?
This is where it gets stark. The CBO estimates, according to the source, that households in the very bottom tenth of the income ladder, the lowest decile, would actually see their resources go down.
Go down. They'd be worse off.
That's the projection. A decrease of about 2% of their income in 2027, and that gap widens to about 4% by 2033.
Why? What's causing that projected decrease for the poorest group?
The main reason cited is expected reductions in what are called in-kind transfers. These are benefits that aren't cash, like government-provided health insurance or food assistance. The article specifically mentions programs like Medicaid, which is health insurance for low-income individuals, and SNAP, the food stamp program. Cuts or changes there hit this group hard.
Okay, so the lowest income group potentially loses ground because of cuts to essential support like healthcare and food aid. That's significant. What about the other end of the scale? The wealthiest.
That's the contrast. For the highest tenth, the top decile, the CBO, projects their resources would increase. They estimate a gain of about 4% in 2027, settling to around 2% in 2033.
an increase for the top earners. And why is that?
According to the CBO analysis mentioned, it's mainly due to reductions in the taxes they would otherwise have to pay, those tax cuts we talked about earlier.
Wow. So a projected drop for the poorest tenth linked to cuts in aid, and a projected rise for the richest tenth linked to tax cuts. That CBO data really highlights that anti-Robin Hood concern, doesn't it?
It certainly provides quantitative backing for that argument, yes. It lays out a very clear potential divergence in outcomes.
Okay, so we've unpacked this very complex bill. We've looked at the beautiful promises proponents are making, the really serious concerns about fiscal health, rising debt, credit downgrades, interest rates, and this potential redistributive impact based on that CBO analysis. So bringing it all together now. What does understanding all this specific U.S. bill, mean for you listening, especially if you're focused on current affairs, maybe for UPSC, or just staying informed? What's the takeaway?
Well, I think it really shows how interconnected everything is. Even a policy that seems purely domestic, like a U.S. tax and spending bill, can have much wider significance. Global economies are linked, right? The fiscal health of the U.S., its policy choices, they really can send ripples around the world. So understanding the details here, the arguments, the CBO's objective look, it helps you build a much sharper understanding of global economics, sure, but also just how governments everywhere try to balance things. It's a classic example, really, of that tension between political promises, spending desires, tax policies, and the hard reality of long-term financial stability. It really raises an important question.
It definitely does. And this deep dive, drawing on that Indian Express article, has really illuminated that core tension, hasn't it? The ambitious goals of the OBBA set against these very significant data-backed worries about debt and inequality.
Exactly. And it underscores the value, as the source material suggests, of relying on objective analysis, like the CBO's work, to cut through the political noise and understand the potential real-world consequences. It's key for being truly informed.
So maybe here's a final thought for you to chew on, something especially relevant if you think about governance or economic policy. Given these projections about debt reaching potentially unsustainable levels and the clear analysis showing who might gain and who might lose under this kind of bill, what are the fundamental trade-offs governments wrestle with when they try to push through big agendas that mix major tax cuts with major spending increases? How do we weigh those potential short-term gains or fulfilled promises against long-term fiscal health and making sure the benefits and burdens are shared fairly? It's a tough balance.
Very tough balance.
And remember, our deep dive today was built on the insights from that detailed article in the Indian Express. If you found this breakdown useful for getting your head around these complex current affairs, perhaps especially if you are preparing for exams like UPSC, or just want that deeper understanding, please do hit that like button right now. And subscribe to the Deep Dive channel. We bring you more in-depth analysis like this straight from the source materials.
Yeah, please do.
And finally, if you have questions about the OBBBA, the CBO findings we discussed, or maybe you have another source, another topic you'd like us to dive deep into, please leave a comment below. We really do value your input and questions.
We love hearing from you.